Okay, team. Today we're going to have this video which deals with the plant propagation lab. So there is this handout which is posted in there, which is the actual information that you'll want to read through. And then the video will sort of explain and give you an idea of, the soil mixes that we're going to talk about, amendments, this type of thing. And we're going to focus on organic agriculture. We will talk a little bit about synthetic amendments as well. Primarily, the idea is we want to develop our own soil mix using ingredients. Now, if we were meeting in real time, we would actually mix this stuff together. Of course, I can't expect you to go out and buy all these amendments and ingredients. And so we're just going to talk about it, and then we'll talk about how you're going to do the lab. There's also a quiz. After you watch the video and you've studied the lab, you can go in and take the quiz. The quiz will be your grade for this lab. In addition to that, we're going to do a propagation experiment, and you'll also be graded on your brief write-up that you're going to do after the experiment's over. Of course, since it's a germination experiment, that's going to take a little bit of time, probably 3 to 4 weeks before you have results. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin talking about this. So one of the things to understand about starting seeds is, there are lots of variables, right? There's all kinds of variables. And, you might think you could just go in your garden and dig up some dirt if you wanted to start some seeds in little cell packs. And that could very well work, but you might think about some caveats of doing that. One of the caveats of doing that is you don't really know the makeup of that soil. You don't know what the pH is. You don't know what the nutrient content is. That's going to be an issue. There could be pathogens in that soil, plant pathogens, which out in nature probably are kept in check, but when you put them in a little cell pack, you could imagine that could create issues. And then the last thing is really weed seeds, and the fact that there's going to be a lot of weed seeds in your soil, most likely. Do you know what the cotyledons look like of every little seed that you're planting? And if not, it's going to be chaos because you're going to be trying to figure out what's a weed and what's your plant. Okay, so these are all pertinent reasons why we might not want to do that. Okay. Yet another reason might be drainage. Most likely, soil straight from the ground is not going to drain very well packed into a little cell pack or a pot of some sort. Okay, so what we want to do, and what I've done as an organic farmer in the past, is developed my own soilless mix. Why soilless? Well, because it doesn't contain any dirt. Okay, so you'll notice here it says soilless potting mix. Okay, and 10 years ago when I started organic farming, you couldn't go to Lowe's and buy a bag of organic potting mix, certified organic potting mix. Now it's everywhere, right? So I was kind of forced to develop my own because I was a certified organic farm. And, it was a challenge to do that, but I came up with these different mixes. And so what we want to do is think about the basic ingredients in the mix. And we're going to look at the 4 basic ingredients, and then we'll talk a little bit about ratios. Okay. So if you do go to the store and buy a mix, it invariably contains peat. Peat is going to be the main ingredient in most mixes. Okay. And so when we start thinking about these different ingredients in our soilless mix, what we want to realize is they each have a purpose, right? Obviously. And so peat moss, a couple of things about it. You'll notice it has a pH of 4 to 5. That is very acidic. And one of the things about plants is they are pretty insulted by acidic conditions, most plants. There are exceptions like blueberries, which enjoy it, but most plants are going to prefer the 6 to 7 range. And so one thing I'll tell you about using peat moss is you have to take that into consideration, and we'll actually take that into consideration a bit later when we add some amendments that will neutralize this pH, okay? Nutrient content insignificant. What does it do? Well, the primary function of the peat in the mix is water retention. Peat moss is really good at absorbing and holding water, and that's why we add it to the mix. It'll hold about 20 times its weight in water. You can take completely dry peat moss and wet it up, and it'll weigh 20 times what the dry weigh. That's very helpful, okay? Some other stuff about it, it is a mined substance that is running out. So one of the things we'll do once we go through these amendments is we'll talk about alternatives and things that we might consider using. So, you know, where does peat come from? It comes from sphagnum bogs, and the peat that we use here is mostly harvested in Canada. You can bet it's a big mess. There's big machinery, it's wetland areas, and they're digging out this peat moss and drying it and selling it. So that is an issue, okay? We might as well talk about alternatives while we're at each one. One of the things that people have used is cocoa coir, which is basically just the husks of coconuts that have been ground up and into this sort of peat moss-like substance, and then we use that in place of the peat moss. I've tried the cocoa coir. One of the advantages of it is it actually has some nutrient content, much higher nutrient content than peat moss has. The texture is not quite the same, and it's a little bit annoying. One of the things that's annoying about it is it's so fine that it'll sometimes fall through the holes in the bottom of your pot, and that's just annoying. It also doesn't wet up quite like peat moss. One last thing I'll mention about peat moss, if it's completely dry, it tends to be a little bit hydrophobic. It doesn't want to wet up. And so you don't want to let it dry out completely. And if it is dry completely and you're mixing up some potting mix, you want to put it in something that doesn't have holes in it, like a wheelbarrow or a bucket, and force it to wet up by adding water to it and letting it soak, okay? And next, and we'll come and look at pictures of these as we go through. The next is perlite. Let's go ahead and look at a picture of some peat moss just for fun. You can see, you know what it looks like. You've seen it in potting mix, and there's a nice picture of it. The next one is perlite. Perlite are these little white balls that you see in your potting mix. If you ever buy a commercial potting mix, it's bound to have a little bit of perlite in it. And so we want to think about, what is it? Perlite is actually puffed. I don't have my annotation now. Perlite is actually puffed lava. They take little lava rocks and they superheat them under pressure and they puff up. Makes this very light, sort of irregularly shaped little balls, if you will, okay? You'll notice it has a neutral pH, that's good. No nutrient content to speak of. And what is the point of it? The function is very important. It is for aeration and drainage. Roots need air, they need oxygen, right? They're living cells, they're doing cellular respiration. This is why we till the soil. To literally till oxygen into the soil helps the plants grow. It also allows for drainage. Although we want the mix to be moist, we don't want it to be super saturated with water. And so these irregularly shaped little balls create space for water to drain through. Okay. You will note it is a nuisance dust, and casual exposure to perlite dust is not going to kill you, but people that work in the industry, let me tell you, they have issues with their health, primarily lung issues. You would want to wear a respirator if you were working with this stuff on a daily basis. Unfortunately, very few probably of the people that work with it do wear respirators because they're annoying. Okay, it is a mined substance. There's big holes in the ground somewhere where they have dug this stuff up. Okay, as far as alternatives to perlite goes, sand Coarse builder sand works pretty well as an alternative, but it's really heavy. And so when you're thinking about on a commercial scale, you're having to deal with all this extra weight. If you were making potting mix, you wouldn't want to use sand if you were selling it because you'd have to pay for the shipping weight. The advantage of the perlite is it's very light. Okay. So, that's something to think about. Vermiculite, oh my goodness. It's one of those things, you love it and you hate it, okay? Vermiculite is actually puffed mica. Mica is a mineral. It's actually very common in Western North Carolina. There's a place called Micaville where there are mica mines. Mica is used in for industrial uses. It's used as an insulator, and then it's used to make vermiculite. And what they do, again, is they superheat it under pressure, and that creates the vermiculite from the mica. And I want to leave the writing on there. Let's look at some vermiculite. And you've seen this stuff before in the mix. It's very shiny and silvery. It does look a lot like mica because it's made from mica. And you can see all these little layers. When they heat it up, all the little plates of mica puff up, and it creates an incredible amount of surface area. And that's really what it's about in terms of function with the vermiculite. It's about creating surface area. There's this thing that's very important. It's called CEC, or cation exchange capacity. And that's really what vermiculite provides to the mix. It provides nutrient retention. This is very important. To a lesser extent, it provides drainage, but what's really important about the vermiculite is that it provides nutrient retention. It's really good at snatching nutrients, and cations are the nutrients, right? Think about all the macro and micronutrients of plants. They're all positively charged for the most part. And what that means is, things like calcium and magnesium. The vermiculite is able to snatch these and hold them and then pass them on to the plant. So what I'm saying is, if you add this vermiculite and then you add some nutrient base, the vermiculite holds that nutrient base. This is important, especially in a potting mix when you're planting plants in little pots, because every time you water the plant, the water leaches the nutrients out. You need something in the mix to hold those nutrients, okay? Well, that's the good side of the vermiculite. The bad side is it's a mined substance. It is a nuisance dust. People that work in the industry have brown lung, literally. It could contain traces of heavy metals like cadmium and mercury and lead. That's not great. So it's one of those things, you love it and you hate it. It's great as a base, as part of the base for growing plants, but at the same time, it can be detrimental to health. Again, casual exposure to the dust is not a big deal, but if you were working with it every day, you would want to take precautions and wear a respirator. It has an insignificant amount of nutrient content. I want you to be clear. It doesn't have nutrients. It just holds the nutrients that you add to the mix. And it has a neutral pH. Okay. And then lastly, and most importantly, I might point out, we want to add compost to our mix. Now, back when I started farming, you couldn't buy a mix that had compost in it. It was all peat moss, perlite, vermiculite, and we'll talk about the no-nos that they add. Once we talk about compost, we'll talk a little bit about the no-nos. Things that they add to make money, basically, that aren't really good for plants. So what about compost? What is compost? Well, here's the thing, y'all. Compost is not made by dumping vegetable scraps into a pile over the course of time and letting them rot. That is not compost. That is a crude form of composting, okay? It's fine if you want to do that, but you're not making compost. Let's be clear. Let's start with the legal definition, because there is one. Compost, by definition, you build a pile and it has to heat up greater than 130 degrees Fahrenheit for 14 days. If you want to put something in a bag and sell it as compost, the USDA says, well, okay, but there's a regulation, and that regulation has to heat up greater than 130 degrees Fahrenheit for 14 days. That means you have to keep track, okay? Why is the heating process, and this says 140, I think it's actually 130, but no worries, 10 degrees, we'll let it go. You know, if you want to make your own compost, get a book and learn how to make it, okay? It's really important to this heating process is incredibly important. What does the heating process accomplish? Kills pathogens. Only thing that can live in that temperature are thermophilic bacteria, which are the friends of the plants, okay? In addition to that, it kills pretty much all weed seeds. And so compost is full of biological activity of beneficial microbes, thermophilic bacteria, thermophilic fungi, that are the friends of the plants that tend to colonize the roots of the plants and keep the pathogenic bacteria and pathogenic fungi off the roots. And so the main thing about the compost that's important that you might not think about is biological activity, beneficial microbes in the mix. You will notice it also has nutrient content, and it's really the only ingredient with nutrient content at this point. It should be about neutral in pH. That's good. And you can see it ranges, this is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It ranges from 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, all the way up to 555. Plus it would contain micronutrients. These are percentages, okay? Now I'm going to tell you, if you're using it in a mix, the 0.5, 0.5, 0.5 is perfect. Perfect concentration of nutrients, plus it has the minors or micronutrients in it. That's very beneficial as well. 555 would be a little on the hot side. You'd want to be careful using something that concentrated. You can always just add less of it, right? Okay. So what I recommend for mix is this stuff called Black Cow. It's commercially available. They do spell it with a K due to some copyright stuff. You can buy a bag of this at Lowe's for $3 or $4. And it is composted cow manure. And it just happens to be 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. And that's what I would recommend using if you're going to mix up some soil. Okay. Now, the other thing to note about compost is this is really the only truly renewable substance on the list. Peat moss seems like it's renewable because it's organic, but guess what? We're using it at a rate much faster than it's produced or formed in these peat bogs. These two are mined substances. That's not renewable. So compost is a really important ingredient in the mix, okay? So those are the 4 things that if you wanted to make a really bombing potting mix to start seeds in, these are the 4 things you would mix together. And these are all pretty much readily available. You know, at the box store, you could get them, and you could certainly order small bags of all this stuff online if you want it, okay? So now the question becomes, you know, what about some sort of ratio? You know, how do we know how much of each of these things to add? Well, assuming you're using a 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, I'm going to give you a very simple ratio that makes an awesome mix. And this is by volume. That's important to understand. It's by volume, not, let me scroll down just a little bit. It's by volume, not weight. Okay, that's important to understand. And what we have for a good all-purpose mix would be a 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. 2 parts peat, 1 part perlite, 1 part vermiculite, 1 part compost. Okay, if you want to adjust, if you want to make the mix a little richer, you could add a little more compost. You want to be careful with that. If you want to make it more fluffy and better drained, like if you're starting things that are finicky and need a really well-drained soil, you could back off on the peat moss. But for the most part, if you mix 2 to 1 to 1 to 1 together, you're going to have this really nice potting mix, and you're going to be probably very happy with it. be as good or better as anything you could buy at the store. Now, here's the other part, though. The other part to this picture is when you're making a potting mix, you really want to add all of the nutrients that you need into the mix so that you don't have to fertilize the plants while they're still in their little pots and before you put them in your garden, or in my case, in your vegetable farm. Okay, it's just you're eliminating that extra step of having to worry about fertilizing them. It's just an extra step that you don't want to have to do. So the idea is you put enough nutrient in the mix to where you can start a seed in a little cell, and that seed can grow big enough with the nutrient that's in that cell to plant into the ground in your garden. Okay. And so what we're going to do then is we're going to amend the soil with these different amendments. And so let's look at those and talk about them. Okay. Here's what we have. First, we need a buffer. And we need a buffer because we need to neutralize the acidic condition of the peat moss. We don't want our mix to be acidic. We want it to be close to neutral. The best buffer really is dolomitic lime, and the dolomitic lime is a really good buffer. It contains calcium and magnesium, okay? And these will neutralize the acidity of the mix. Now, here's the thing, you know, how much do you add? If you're using a wheelbarrow and you're using a 5-gallon bucket, let's say a 3-gallon bucket, that's more realistic. If you add 2 to 1 to 1 to 1, that would be 6 gallons of peat moss. To that 6 gallons of peat moss, you could safely add 1 cup. And because it's so slow acting, it's kind of hard to add too much, but a cup would be plenty to 6 gallons of peat. Okay. So now I will tell you, when you're mixing your soil, you really want to add the lime straight to the peat and mix it in. That's important, okay? Because that's the acidic component. You could just add it at the end, but it makes more sense to put the peat in your container and mix it, you know, by hand if you're doing it in a wheelbarrow, okay? Now we need NPK. And we need micronutrients or miners. Okay, and so let's look at what we have. Now, these are choices that organic farmers have to make all the time. When I was organic farming, I always wanted to use blood meal, and my farm partner always wanted to use soybean meal. I would say, but blood meal, first of all, works better. And she would say, well, yeah, but it's a byproduct of the slaughterhouse industry. It's probably full of hormones and antibiotics, you know, and are vegans okay with blood on their vegetables? And I can tell you right now, most of them are not. You know, I would sell my plant starts at the tailgate market, and, you know, someone would say, what do you fertilize it with? And I would say blood meal, and they would be horrified if they were vegans. They were like, no way, I'm not buying that. I'm not even buying a plant that's fertilized with blood, okay? So those were her arguments. She wanted to use soybean meal, and we'll talk about soybean meal in a second. It's solvent extracted, meaning they soak the soybeans in xylene, like ether basically, to extract the protein. And then it's most likely genetically modified. You know, so these are the choices that organic farmers are trying to make. Okay, I will tell you the blood meal works really well. It's 1400. Anytime you see this thing where there's a number and then another number in parentheses, this is telling you the availability. So this is telling you it's 14% nitrogen total, but only about 2% is available at any given time. That's really good. It slow releases over time, okay? Is it a renewable resource? I mean, as long as people keep eating animals, it is, right? You might think of it that way. Soybean meal is 700. The issue that I always had with soybean meal, I mean, the 7 is plenty of nitrogen. You could just double the amount. The problem I have with soybean meal is it's not releasing, it's not releasing, it's not releasing. Boom, it just spikes and it just dumps all this nitrogen into the mix. That's not good. That's not a good thing. Okay. Um, so, you know, for our mix, for the mix that we're talking about today, I honestly prefer the blood meal in the mix. Okay. For phosphate, we're going to use colloidal phosphate. This is a mined substance that contains phosphorus, and it's mined mostly in Florida, the stuff that we get here. It's not really a renewable resource as a mined substance, right? It has 22% phosphate, but only 2 available. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, if there's one thing that the soil is depleted of in Western North Carolina, it's phosphorus. And if there's one thing that you can do to help your garden, it's buy a bag of colloidal phosphate and dump it in there. It will be there 10 years from now, still releasing its phosphate into the soil. Okay, so it's really, really beneficial. It also contains micronutrients or miners. What are the miners? Well, think about it. Boron, copper is actually Cu, magnesium, calcium, manganese, etc. These are all, they're the same as, think about your multivitamin. They're the same micronutrients that animals need, right? And so plants need them as well. And so this is very beneficial. Okay. Green sand is another mined substance. That's what we're using for potassium. You'll notice it's 80% potassium, but only 0.2 is available. And then it has all of the miners in it. It's wonderful. It has, you know, literally, it's what it is it's mined in places where there used to be oceans. And the what has happened is, you know, all of the ocean critters that have died over eons and eons sink down to the bottom. That's what green sand is. It's literally a greenish colored sand. It's become a little hard to find. It's running out because it's a mined substance. But it is an excellent source of micronutrients as well as very, very slow release potassium. I will tell you that generally the soil in Western North Carolina has a fair amount of potassium in it, but is lacking in phosphorus. Okay, so back to the garden thing, if there's 2 things you can do, get a pH test and probably need to add some lime and add some colloidal phosphate and your garden will be very happy. Okay, so how much of this stuff to add? Well, if you're using a 3-gallon bucket and you have 15 gallons of mix, because it's 6 gallons of peat and 3 gallons of perlite and 3 gallons of vermiculite and 3 gallons of compost, that's 15 gallons. You could add a cup of dolomitic lime. It says 1.5 cups. That would be fine too. And then 1 cup each of the blood, the phosphate, the green sand. Azomite is something that you may want to add. It contains, they call it azomite because it contains all the micronutrients from A to Z, okay? So azomite is an optional thing that you could add and it would really beef up the micronutrients, okay? Now I will tell you, out of these micronutrients, the blood is the one that can screw you over, right? It's nitrogen. Microbes love nitrogen, including pathogenic organisms, right? If you overdo the blood, you run this risk of creating a haven for fungi and bacteria, some of which may not be good, the good guys, okay? So you can always back off on the blood. You don't want to overdo it on the blood, particularly if you're dealing with finicky things like, for example, when I'm germinating solanaceous crops like peppers and tomatoes, I usually just leave the blood out for germination. Because they tend to rot. Same with large seeds. They tend to rot. Flowers don't need the blood, generally. There's enough nutrient in just the compost to get flowers going. Just be careful with the blood. That's my advice. Okay. Now, there are some no-nos, and I said we were going to talk about the no-nos a bit. And then we'll talk a little bit about the experiment. I'm not going to go through all of the organic gardening stuff. I do expect you to go through it. It's all written out for you. It explains a lot about the organic world, synthetic versus organic. just read through it, and it is on the quiz, so you might want to study it up a little bit. Okay. There are some questions. If you can answer these questions, that would probably be helpful on the quiz. Okay. So what are some no-nos? What are some things that the industry adds that aren't really added to benefit plant growth, but added to make money? That's the thing. Here are the no-nos. The no-nos include bark, sawdust, wood chips. They'll mix these in and, like, say 10% into their soil mix. Why in the world are they doing this if they're not good for plants? Because they make 10% more money. This stuff is basically free. And if they can dump a little into your mix, then they're going to make money, right? Well, the problem with these things is that they're big chunks of carbon, right? And when you mix carbon and nitrogen together, like we're doing in a potting mix, the nitrogen goes to the carbon to try to decompose it. And this is exactly what happens when they add this stuff. What happens is the nitrogen gets tied up trying to decompose these chunks of carbon. It's basically your soil mix is composting, while you're trying to grow plants in it. To compensate for this, you'll often see these little green balls. Sometimes they're green or white. See these little green balls in your soil mix that you buy from Lowe's? This is time-released synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. This is their way of dealing with the fact that they dumped this stuff into your mix and it's not so great. One of the things that they do for perlite as a alternative is use styrofoam. They take the styro BBs, which would normally end up in the landfill, they crush them up into little perlite-sized pieces, and they add them to the mix. In one sense, they're recycling something that would go to the landfill. In another sense, when you plant that in the ground, that styrofoam is there forever. It never goes away when it's buried in the ground. So you're adding styrofoam to your garden, basically. So that's something else you might see. Okay. So, avoid mix that has this stuff in it if you can. And that's why making your own is really nice. Okay. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do with the experiment. Now, there is a quiz. Okay. The quiz covers what we just talked about, including this information on organic, and I think it's good for you to read through this, particularly this part where it talks about prohibited, restricted, and acceptable substances, and then things that are obviously prohibited, and then you don't have to memorize all the stuff about organic pesticides and organic fertilizers and soil amendments. Some of this we already talked about, but just read through that part and you should be fine, especially if you answer the questions. Okay. And now let's talk a little bit about our experiment. Okay. Here's the thing. Normally we would have you in the greenhouse mixing up soil. I would provide seeds for you. I can't expect you to go and buy all this stuff. That's not required. But what is going to be required at the very least is you need to get some seeds. Now, here's the thing. For seeds, well, not that big of a deal if you think about it, even if you're poor, because beans, popcorn, these are seeds. They're very cheap, right? At the very least, you could go to the store, you could buy a bag of beans or a bag of popcorn and use those for seeds. They'll work fine. Black-eyed peas, any kind of bean. They're not going to be that old. They're going to probably be viable, okay? Other things you can do, you could go to the health food store, the food co-op, and you could buy things like coriander, right? You could buy poppy seeds. These are all things that any kind of whole seed at the Earth Fare or the food co-op or somewhere like that. If you want to go the cheapest route, though, a bag of beans is probably going to be about 99 cents. Rice won't work really because it's been processed. Brown rice might germinate, but I wouldn't recommend it. If you have any garden seeds left over, if you have access to seeds, or if you just want to go buy some seeds, then you can do that as well. Okay. Any seeds will work for this experiment. Okay. The experiment, it's important to understand, is a germination or propagation experiment. It's really a germination experiment. So when you write up your report, don't tell me they grew really well. That's not what I want to hear. What I want to hear is the germination rate. That's the experiment. So some things to think about. If it's a germination rate experiment and you plant one seed, well, that doesn't do any good, right? Because then it's either 100% or 0%. So what's a logical thing? Maybe like 10 seeds would make sense, or 20, and then each one is 5%. If you do 10, each one is 10%. So what you're ultimately trying to get is a germination rate based upon some independent variable. So here's the thing. Students get mixed up with dependent and independent variables like crazy, okay? There can only be one of each in a given experiment if it's a good experiment, okay? The way to remember this is dependent depends upon independent. That's a very simple way to remember when you're dealing with the scientific method of investigation. You need to develop a hypothesis, right? So what does this mean? Well, the dependent variable depends upon the independent. We all have the same dependent variable. In this case, it's germination rate. That's our dependent variable. We all have the same one, okay? So you could put the words germination rate in there for dependent, and we could say, okay, dependent depends upon independent. Germination rate depends upon some other variable that you get to decide. You only get to pick one. Here are some examples, right? Things like light, moisture, sound, planting depth, temperature, stratification and scarification. You know what those are. Stratification is a cold treatment. Scarification is physically scarring the seed, okay? You're going to develop an experiment. The way it works is you're going to first come up with a hypothesis. Use an if-then statement. So for example, if plants need moisture to germinate, then we believe the seeds in the moist soil mix will germinate at a higher rate. Okay, that's how it works. So you're going to write out a hypothesis, formulate a hypothesis as an if-then statement. Okay, at that point, you're going to design and implement your experiment. Make sure you have control variables in your experiment. If you're doing dry and wet, then have a sort of moist in between as your control, as what you would expect. Okay, where are you going to get the soil from? Well, unfortunately, I don't know. That's up to you. At the very worst, you're going to go out in the woods or go in your yard and dig up some dirt. You could, since it's just a germination experiment, if your variable was, let's say, light or temperature, heck, you could just use a moist paper towel if you wanted, okay? Because we're having to do this on our own, I realize it's not going to be quite as maybe scientific as we would hope, but do your best. So the goal is within the next week, you're going to design and implement this experiment. You're going to take notes, and you're going to note germination rate over time, okay? So you're going to see, you know, by day maybe or something like that, how many seeds germinated, whatever, okay? And then you're going to do a little write-up in a couple of weeks, and I'll give you some credit or a grade of some sort for this. We'll see how it goes. It might actually be a whole separate, we might get a whole nother lab grade for this write-up. I think that's probably how it's going to play out, okay? So that's the scoop, y'all. Be thinking about it. If you have questions, feel free to email me, let me know. Okay. I hope that this was enjoyable to you. Hope you learned some stuff. I think you probably did. And I think you're going to learn even more when you start messing with the seeds. Okay. And just make sure I'm not leaving anything out. These are only suggestions, and you can come up with your own. I've had groups do all sorts of wacky things, okay, in the past. I'm sorry that we don't get to actually meet and do this in person, okay. Hope y'all have a great day. Remember, one lab is due a week. This lab, um, you know, there'll be a lab to follow this lab, so just keep up with the labs. You're turning in one a week. But for now, for this lab, the only thing you have to do is take the quiz. You don't have to turn in your write-ups for about 3 or 4 weeks. All right, signing off, team. Take care. Stay well.